Hi, I'm Robbie Bobby, Grateful ACA, and the topic of this video is 12 ways to look at the 14 traits, part 1. So in this video I'm going to cover the first 3, so please check my YouTube channel for the parts, I guess, 2, 3, and 4. I'll probably do 3 per video. Okay, so let's begin. The 14 traits of ACA, otherwise known as the laundry list, is what unites the ACA fellowship. The traits represent the psychological effects of growing up in an alcoholic or otherwise dysfunctional home, and then carrying those effects into adult life. Recovery in ACA begins by identifying with these traits, admitting that you're powerless over them, and that they make your life unmanageable. This happens to be step 1 in the ACA 12-step program. I believe there's a correlation between the identification with the traits and how much work one is willing to do in order to recover from them. When I first came into ACA, I understood what the traits meant only on a surface level. Then I decided trait by trait if I had them. These were the 2 initial ways that I looked at the traits. I've since come up with 10 additional ways, and this helps me to understand them on a deeper level, and therefore it keeps me motivated to do my recovery work. In this video, I'd like to share 3 of the ways that I look at these common traits of adult children of alcoholics. I'll start with the most common way to look at the traits, which I've already mentioned, which is asking myself, do I have them, and to what degree? This is probably the most important way to look at the traits. It's called identification. I remember going down the laundry list for the first time. I identified with a couple of the traits a lot, some to a lesser degree, and a few either not at all or barely. Some I just didn't understand. Which brings up the second way to look at the traits. What do they mean? And I think it's fair to say that how I understand or interpret the trait will affect my identification with the trait. After working the laundry list workbook with a group of fellow travelers, I went from identifying with 8 or 9 traits to all 14. And the level of identification went up for those I had already identified with, simply because I understood them better. Here's one example for trait 1. Trait 1 reads, we became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures. When I first read that trait, I interpreted it as isolating physically. And since I had a girlfriend and a number of other friends that I often spent time with, I considered that one to be on the low end. I didn't write it off completely because after spending a certain amount of time with people, it was always a relief to be back home by myself. I definitely needed my alone time. However, I was not what you would call a loner, and I did enjoy being with people, at least certain people. Then, after doing some work on this trait, I realized I can also isolate myself emotionally. I realized that I often felt alone even with my girlfriend or in a group of people. This expanded my definition or my understanding of isolating. I also expanded my understanding of authority figures, which at first I thought of as a policeman or maybe a boss, but then I realized I can make anyone an authority figure. If I thought someone knew more than me, I would make them an authority figure. Doctors were authority figures, any professional. My parents, just because they were my parents. My wife when I was married, even when I was divorced. Slowly, the list of authority figures expanded, and with it, my identification with the trait. So the point here is to continue drilling into these traits, hopefully with fellow travelers. You can learn a lot by listening to other people talking about how the traits show up in their lives. And of course, avail yourself to ACA's literature. There's a lot written about these traits. Doing so will expand both your understanding as well as your identification with the 14 traits. By the way, I've never lowered my identification for any of the traits. Gaining clarity has always increased my identification. As a result, my resolve to work the ACA program has only increased since I came into program. Okay, so those are the first two ways. Now on to the third. And the third way has to do with symptoms. Each trait is associated with certain feelings and possible behaviors, what I call the symptoms of the traits. It's a good exercise to go down the list of 14 traits and think about all the ways they show up in your life. Write them down. This way you may be able to recognize when a particular trait is active by recognizing one of the symptoms. In my opinion, this is an important way to look at and understand the traits, how they really operate and function inside of you. Here's an example. Trait 1 says, we became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures. For me, the list of symptoms includes staying home or avoiding people, not reaching out to anyone. They call that the 900-pound telephone. These are some of the more obvious behaviors associated with isolating. But there are some behaviors that are not as obvious, such as approval seeking or people pleasing, which is something I can easily do when I'm with other people. In my opinion, this is a form of isolating my authentic self. When I do this, I can feel just as isolated as sitting in a room by myself. And what are the feelings? Could be feeling lonely, that's obvious. Could also be feeling depressed or bored. These are a few possible feelings associated with isolating that I identify with. I find that trait 2, we became approval seekers and lost our identity in the process, has a different set of possible behaviors and feelings associated with it, including doing things that I really don't want to do, behavior, and being resentful about it, feeling. So you see, this doesn't have to be complicated. Just go down the list of traits, note 1 or 2 behaviors and feelings along the way. The list will grow over time. As it does, so will your understanding of the traits and ultimately your recovery. Okay, so that's all the time we have for this video. In this talk, I presented the first 3 ways that I look at the traits, which included 1, identification, 2, understanding, and 3, symptoms, how they show up in my life. In the next video, I'll present the next 3, and I'll give you the heads up on what they are. There'll be number 4, what triggers them, 5, at what age did they start showing up in my life, and 6, how did they help me as a child? I'm Robbie Bobby. Thank you for listening, and as always, keep coming back.